You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 28th of October 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up on today's programme...
It was like a Russian special operation. It was Russian elections. We are not going to recognize these elections.
We'll follow the fallout over the disputed Georgian elections. We'll examine the Indo-Chinese relationship and how it's changing. And we'll have an update on elections in Uruguay and Brazil. Plus...
One of the most fascinating things about the initial subway that was opened in 1904 is that it was, by and large, done by hand. That means pickaxes, shovels, donkey carts, pulling debris out.
We'll hear from the New York Transit Museum director as the city's subway system celebrates its 120th anniversary. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Georgina Godwin. We begin the show in Georgia, where the results of the weekend poll, in which the governing party was declared victorious, have been met with accusations of voting irregularities and allegations of Russian meddling. Donald Rayfield, Emeritus Professor of Russian and Georgian at Queen Mary University of London, joins me now to discuss this. Donald, many thanks for coming on the show. Can you remind us briefly of what the Georgian people were voting on?
They were voting really on... whether to pursue an EU-oriented policy, following EU rules on freedom of speech, on not having repressive rules about homosexuality or the persecution of minorities and so on. That was one alternative, and the alternative was the present government, which has been in power now for some 10 years, and which is clearly Russian-oriented. It takes the view that it doesn't want to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It doesn't want to provoke Russia, and it wants business ties and possibly diplomatic ties with Russia. It's a bit mealy-mouthed about its aims, but it's clearly pro-Russian oriented, even more so, say, than Hungary today.
And are the results, do we have all the results in yet?
We have enough results to show that they were quite clever. There are major irregularities in the election, particularly the fact that in rural areas where nobody was observing, the Georgian Dream got 90% of the vote, which is unlikely. We have videos of busloads of country people being taken to polling stations and given bags of groceries in exchange for their votes. We have videos of polls being stuffed into envelopes, and many credible reports of people being roughed up and beaten if they try to observe the elections. But it's quite cleverly done. A dictator usually likes to have 80% or 90% majority. They fixed it so it's 54%, which some people will find credible.
Well, what does the opposition say about this?
Well, they say that it was rigged. They say that the Russians were behind it. I dare say the Russians are very pleased with it, and it may be the Russians didn't have to do anything, that Bidzina Ivanishvili and his thugs managed it all by themselves. The fact is, actually, that people can loathe Georgian Dream, but they can fear the consequences of not voting for them. The consequences of voting against them might be major Russian interference, and they know that the EU will support them with words and condemnations, but not actually boots on the ground, and they could share the fate of Ukraine in a way that they could lose even more territory. Their electricity supplies could be threatened. All sorts of things could happen. So out of sheer fear, people would vote for or not vote for the opposition. That may be one reason why it hasn't done so well.
So the opposition were talking about calling for mass protests. Have those started?
I haven't heard of anything started. I think they were due to start today. My sense is that the mass protest will probably be smaller than the protests that came onto the streets when they passed the Russian law about foreign agents and another Russian law about lesbians and gays, because they know there will be a heavy police crackdown, and Ivanishvili has threatened to put in prison the entire opposition and presumably people who vote for it. It's enough to intimidate.
You mentioned that the EU would, of course, support them with words, but possibly not much else. I mean, it's not only the EU and the opposition crying foul. Many international bodies and other nations have also said that there are voting irregularities. Are they calling for anything concrete to be done?
Sorry, are they?
Calling for anything concrete to be done. Will there be any punitive action upon Georgia?
For nearly 2,000 years, the Georgians have been appealing to the West for some sort of physical intervention to save them from tyranny. They've been to Rome in 140 AD. They've been to Spain in the 15th century. They've been to Burgundy. And each time they get a promise of help. And the help consists of half a dozen missionaries, or today a few NGO representatives. And it does them no good, and they are abandoned. So their experience is of kind words, good wishes, and no action. They saw that in 2008 when Russia took 20% of their territory. There were protests. There weren't even proper sanctions, and the whole thing has been left as a frozen conflict. So people are much more cynical than they were about offers of help and support from the West.
You mentioned Rome and missionaries. How important has the church been in this?
Well, surprisingly enough, the church has been very important. When I first went to Georgia under the Soviet regime, the church was just a convenience. When you had a barbecue in the cemetery, you took your sheep or your chicken to be blessed by the priest, and then you had a picnic in the cemetery. And suddenly, after independence, the church became very important. People in minibuses would start crossing themselves every time a minibus passed a church. And the remarkable thing about the church is that it has continued exactly as it was. The higher ranks of the church were all appointed by the KGB. The patriarch himself, documentary evidence shows he was a KGB agent. And yet he is the only man who can be photographed shaking Putin's hand and nobody protests. And the church is deeply conservative and anti-Western. It's anti-Western for a number of reasons. When independence came and there was terrible economic problems, starvation virtually, American churches like the Jehovah's Witnesses came and distributed rice and cooking oil and made many, many converts. And an anti-Western feeling grew in the church, and the prejudice against lesbians and gays is something very, very deep, even among liberal Georgians. If you go back to the 12th century, the Church Council by King David IV issued a warning that homosexuality had destroyed the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, that it caused miasmas which led to earthquakes and was the ruin of empires. And that sort of belief is very deeply entrenched. And the fact that the opposition is associated with young people who want more tolerance, and it makes the church even more powerful. So the church is definitely on the side of Georgian dream, and it is a powerful force in Georgian politics.
Donald, finally, I mean, is this the end then for Georgia's possible membership of the EU?
My feeling was that it was always a carrot held out at a great distance. That the very fact that Georgia is isolated from any other EU country, it has no boundary with an EU country, and the fact that it has two frozen conflicts with South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Russian hands means that the EU will keep on making paths and steps to it, but I don't think it'll ever get there. I don't think Moldova has much more chance than Georgia at the moment.
Donald, thank you very much indeed. That was Donald Rayfield, Emeritus Professor of Russian and Georgian at Queen Mary University of London. Now, here's Monica Lillis with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Georgina. Israeli forces continue their strikes into Gaza and Lebanon after launching attacks over Iran over the weekend. The offensive comes as ceasefire talks between the US, Israel and other actors in the region continue. Coalition building in Japan continues after this weekend's vote stripped the ruling LDP's parliamentary majority for the first time in 15 years. Reports from Tokyo have said a vote on the next prime minister may be held on November the 11th. And finally, Shanghai's authorities have cracked down on Halloween costumes this year. Many in the city's financial centre were rounded up over the weekend and taken to administrative buildings to remove their costumes. The move comes after many residents wore costumes with political messages last year. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Monica. We head to India next to join Maya Sharma, a journalist based in Bangalore. Maya, there's recently been a sea change in the relationship between Russia and China. Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi held their first bilateral meeting in 5 years. That was at the BRICS summit in Russia last week. Before that took place, what was the situation between the two countries?
Well, the situation between India and China has not been very good for years now. Of course, the two countries were at war back in the 1960s. But more recently, ever since a rather terrible clash in 2020 at the border, which saw the loss of lives of both Indian and Chinese soldiers in hand-to-hand combat, it was a very gruesome clash. And ever since 2020, the situation really deteriorated. The border has been a very sticky subject between these two major countries in this region. They are both regional superpowers, if you could say that. But it has been a very tricky thing, especially because of what happened in the Galwan Valley in 2020, when soldiers from both sides clashed. And there has been tension along the border after this, and it has certainly not been a good relationship. So this meeting between the two leaders of the countries and the talk of peace and de-escalation is to be welcomed, as is in this troubled world we're in now with so much violence going on. Any kind of talk of peace is to be welcomed, but it's just the beginning, really.
So what progress has been made in reducing tensions?
Well, what has been going on now, and again, both countries have not been very detailed when it comes to official releases, but it is believed that early this week, today or tomorrow, the disengagement process is actually happening as we speak, that there may be the removal of some temporary or some permanent structures which are close to the border, close to the areas of dispute, especially in Ladakh, the Ladakh region of India, that some of those structures on both sides may be reduced, that some of the soldiers may be moving out. There will be less armed forces on each side at this point. So that is believed to be going on, and disengagement is likely to continue this week, perhaps till tomorrow. But of course, like I said, nothing really official, no official details. But the process is said to have started, but it is really a very early stage right now. There will be more talks ahead with special representatives.
I wonder how this rapprochement impacts on India's relationship with the West and how the West deals with China. Is India now a really important piece of that?
It's a very interesting stage right now because many Western countries, including the United States, have certainly shown that they're far more comfortable dealing with India than dealing with China. And they would perhaps like to see India as a counterpoint to China and build up India so that the West dependence on China, whether it's in manufacturing and other areas, actually reduces. So how would they see this kind of rapprochement between these two major countries is a very interesting point. Russian officials have welcomed it. Russian officials have welcomed the dialogues between the two countries. But whether the West sees this as perhaps a weakening of their position vis-a-vis China in case India is not anti-China anymore. I mean, China and India have always been at least competitors, sometimes adversaries, but they have at least been rivals and competitors on the world stage. And with India trying to get a bigger role on the world stage and China trying to hold on in the face of certain amount of Western hostility, it'll be very interesting to see what a greater closeness between the two countries really means for Western democracies.
And of course, their economies have always, they've always been a lot of trade between the two.
Oh, yes, there's a lot of trade right now between China. Actually, shortly after the clash in the Galwan Valley, there was a whole move in India to boycott Chinese products, to not buy things made in China. Several apps were banned in India. Chinese apps were banned in India. So there was a kind of action like that because of the anger at China. But no, trade is flourishing. The Chinese goods are there through the market. They're much cheaper. So the trade is flourishing. Even while there was hostility at the border, the trade between the two countries is very big. I mean, each other's markets are huge. China wants access to India's domestic market, especially as it's facing a bit of an economic crisis of its own. And India, of course, does want trade with the world. And it's very important also, like, it's not a coincidence really that this meeting took place on the sideline of BRICS, which is, of course, a non-Western grouping of countries, that these two major countries in BRICS should not be seen to be hostile towards each other, because that would weaken the grouping itself. So yes, trade does go on.
Yeah. And finally, how is it being covered in India? What do ordinary Indians think about this, and is the media making much of it?
Well, the media is certainly making a lot of it. I think the media in both countries are saying it's advantage to their respective countries. In India, it's looked as a deal of peace. But there has also been opposing voices, whether it's from the opposition parties or whether even from retired defense personnel, and sometimes the common person as well, who perhaps sees it as a bit of a step down by India after the hostility, after the horror of the attacks in 2020, after the combat in 2020. They are wondering if India is backing down in a certain way. That has been expressed more on social media than in mainstream media, which is, again, very largely pro-government at this particular stage. So they are viewing it as the pro-government media is really viewing it as as progress, as something which should happen. But there have been questions raised really about what it will cost India in the long term.
Maya, thank you very much indeed. That's Maya Sharma there, a journalist based in Bangalore. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio, 17 minutes past the top of the hour. Uruguay, a country of 3.4 million, went to the polls this weekend to elect a president and also voted on referendums to lower the retirement age by 5 years to 60 and remove curbs on police carrying out nighttime raids on private homes. Well, joining me now is Fernando Augusto Pacheco, who's Monocle's senior correspondent. Just before we get into this, you've just rushed from a screening. What were you seeing?
I did. I just saw Blitz, the new Steve McQueen film. Great film. I see a lot of chances in the award seasons for it.
Excellent. Fernando, why is Uruguay a bit of an anomaly in Latin American politics?
It is very much an anomaly, and I think that's the story itself on how smooth they vote. Of course, the election's going for a runoff between two moderates, I have to say, Georgina. The current president, Luis Lacalle Pou from the center-right, he can't go for re-election because that's the law in Uruguay, but he's fairly popular with 50% of the vote, 50% of voters approving him, even though the center-left was ahead with about 40% of the vote, with Yamandu Orsi, who was very close to José Mujica, the 89-year-old former president of Uruguay. He was a little bit eccentric. He became a little bit of an icon for the left. The candidate for the current president is going for the runoff. His name is Álvaro Delgado. And it's interesting. Yes, they have different views, of course, but there's no kind of mudslinging what you see in Argentina, in Brazil. And I think that's quite exciting. I think the other countries in the region should look at Uruguay on how to deal with that. But still, nevertheless, I think it's going to be an exciting race because the left went ahead on the first round. But let's not forget that the third place in this election, which was kind of a media-savvy guy, Andrés Ojeda, he is more kind of to the right spectrum. And I presume his supporters would support the current administration, the center-right. So I think it will be quite neck to neck. So it's still exciting. It's very smooth, but exciting.
So that's the second round. When is that?
24th of November. So in about a month's time, Uruguayans are heading back to the polls as well. And you're saying, they also had a referendum, a very important one about lowering, the age where you can retire. That was rejected. People were worried about that it would increase the deficit of the country. So, it's quite interesting, a very politicized nation, I would say.
But yet a strangely calm one. Why do you think that Uruguay differs?
They've always been like that. They're known as the Switzerland of South America. It's very peaceful, and they're also quite liberal in a way. When the left was in power between 2005 and 2020, they had, they relaxed the abortion laws. They had laws for same-sex marriage. They legalized recreational marijuana. They were one of the first countries in the region to do that as well.
Let's talk to your country now, Brazil,
yes.
Which also voted for the second round of its municipal elections yesterday. Do you think that these results point to who will do well in the 2026 presidential elections?
Yes, and I like to say these municipal elections in Brazil are a big deal. All the cities that couldn't decide on the first round, they voted, especially the bigger ones like São Paulo, where I'm from. And there's been a lot of interesting, I've been analyzing the numbers the whole night. The right still very strong in Brazil. But Georgina, the story here is a different right. It's not the Bolsonaro type of right, which is quite more to the far right limit. I would say the center right, the more moderate right, did very well. So in the end, the results were not very good for Jair Bolsonaro, but not to Lula as well. I think the progressive candidates and the leftist ones, they didn't have a good night at all. So I predict that in 2026 there will be new candidates from the right that perhaps will not be Jair Bolsonaro, that will bring, perhaps more kind of pro-business, but still not extreme like Bolsonaro had, which denied COVID, among so many other things that have been discussed. And I think that's quite an interesting one to look out for.
And what about Lula? Is he a little weakened after the results?
He is Lula, and Lula is a funny one because, he is his third term overall. I think Lula is stronger than the left in Brazil. I think the problem with the left in the country, it's difficult to find new leadership. It's very much about Lula. And there's been a lot of commentators talking about that the left is not managing to connect, especially with the poorer communities, because that mentality have changed. When Lula became president, Brazil didn't have many social programs. I mean, he really revolutionized. He created this kind of new middle class in the country. But now those people expect those social programs already. He really changed that. And I think, and sometimes they voted for Lula, but they still have very religious beliefs. They perhaps are more conservative, but they voted for Lula for gratitude for his name. But that doesn't mean that they are necessarily from the left. So I think the left will need to kind of connect with this, people that live in the favelas. Perhaps they disconnected a bit. Perhaps they were mainly talking to some members of the middle classes in the urban centers who like to talk about behavioral costumes. Let's talk about abortion, about gay rights, which, fair enough, it's a big deal, but maybe not so much for people in those communities. That they want a different type of kind of speech from the left as well.
Fernando, of course, we know that the US election is coming up next week and all eyes are on that. How do you think that the result there is going to influence Brazil? Well,
I think it will be hugely influential, especially with Lula in power. I wonder what's going to be Lula's relationship with Trump if he wins, because Lula, let's be honest, he's center-left, but he's also pragmatic. He had a great relationship with George Bush when he was in power. It was, quite odd because they were from different elements of the spectrum. So there will be some question marks here and there. I do think probably for the region, I think Kamala Harris win, there will be a little bit more focus on the region. But I have to say, Georgina, I don't think both candidates, they care that much about Latin America. I think when they talk about South America, it's always, talking about illegal immigration, about the border. It's funny because it's quite close, some of their neighboring countries. But I don't see much of Latin America being discussed in the American campaign, which is quite odd, in my opinion, especially because of the geographical location of it.
Fernando, thank you very much indeed. That's Fernando Augusto Pacheco, Monocle's senior correspondent. And you're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Passengers in New York City rode on vintage train cars yesterday as the subway celebrated its 120th anniversary. The transit system now carries an average of over 3.5 million people each day and has become an integral part of the city's DNA. Monocle's Anita Riotta spoke with Conchetta Benchivenga about the subterranean institution's impact and where the next 120 years might take it. Conchetta first told us what led to the creation of the New York City subway.
First of all, New York City, up until 1898, is defined only by the island of Manhattan, and the vast majority of the people are living on the 1/3 lower portion of the island of Manhattan. So you've got this incredible amount of horse and human gridlock. You can't really move around very easily. And so throughout most of the second half of the 1880s, they are sort of iterating and trying different ways to move people about. So we have a system of elevated trains that come in, but they're very noisy, they're very dirty, they're very disruptive, but they do the job okay. And we also have a system of trolley cars, all pulled by horses. And so there are two kind of seismic moments in the late 1800s that really lead New York to think like, okay, we might have to go underground. The first, as it happens, was an equine flu, and it really incapacitated New York City. And so that was really when the city kind of leaned into the notion of doing elevated trains, which was great for a moment until 1888. In the spring of 1888, there was a fluke nor'easter, there was a blizzard, and it basically snowed in New York City, including elevated trains. And so people had to be rescued from 2 stories up. You have this confluence of factors that, not least of which other cities or the European cities were starting to buy into the notion of an underground. And so between things that were going on in New York City that were not so great, and then also this sort of movement abroad of people buying into the notion of a subway, it was decided that New York should do one of its own. It is really and truly an engineering marvel, not least of which because Manhattan is an island, right? And so you have to deal with a lot of water. One of the most fascinating things about the initial subway that was opened in 1904 is that it was by and large done by hand. That means pickaxes, shovels, donkey carts, pulling debris out. I mean, it really was very much a human endeavor. It's really incredible to think about New York City on October 26th, 1904, and then New York City on October 27th onward, because it really was that transformational for the city. And, you know, on the day of, folks weren't exactly sure how it was going to go, and people weren't sure how New Yorkers would adapt to it. And the answer is quite well. Over 100,000 people came out to try the first subway section, which is 9 miles long and was and consisted of 28 stations. And then the next day, which was a Sunday, over 1 million people came out to try the subway. And so New Yorkers have been bought in from the jump on the notion of a subway, and really were incredibly eager and unanimous adopters from the first full day of operation. And then really what happened almost instantaneously is you understand that some of the things that were kind of baked into the design of the system were going to have to be improved. Initially, because a lot of the design came from a movement that percolated in the United States in the late 1800s, which was called the City Beautiful movement. And that is the notion that if you have a better built physical environment, you would speak to people's better angels and they might hypothetically behave better. Turns out to be completely true. How that impacted the design of the subway, however, is rather than mass transit systems around the world where you've experienced somebody who kind of like jostles down the aisle and collects fares along the way, this was meant to be a rather elevated affair where you would go and you would buy your ticket at a ticket booth, and then you would redeem your ticket at a gate with a sort of gate agent or something like that. It becomes immediately and glaringly apparent that we're going to need to sort of think about what different means there can be to move people through the system more quickly. And so you see the evolution and the design of turnstiles, where you would drop your nickel in. If you can believe it, it cost a nickel to ride the subway. So you drop your nickel in the turnstile and you'd go through. That was really kind of almost evident from that very first day that we were going to need a better way to move massive amounts of people through the system. We are one of the few systems in the world that is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, right? So we don't close. Sort of that's the moniker of the city that never sleeps. And so a lot of the conversations that you're seeing happen today in New York City are just the latest iteration of what that challenge and change looks like, right? It can be a change as simple as this entire grid, this mass transportation network in the larger New York City area has a cadence that is really about getting people from the outer boroughs or from Long Island or Westchester. It's really to get folks from outside of New York City into New York City for the working hours, and then in the evening they reverse the commute. What's interesting now in New York is that cadence is actually changing a bit. There are entire swaths of people, many people, who live in Brooklyn and work in Queens, or live in Queens and work in Brooklyn. They will never step foot on the island of Manhattan. Therefore, the subway has to adjust accordingly. I think another way that we talk about this sort of challenge and change is baked in was a relatively low fare, that 5-cent fare. It was pretty cost effective in 1904, not so cost effective in the 40s, but part of that is an underlying principle that the subway should be for everyone. And what's changed in 2024 is the definition of everyone. And so now you see a lot of conversations about access to elevators or making the system more user-friendly to people who have, low vision or are blind. And that's actually good change. That just means that our definition of the subway is for everyone has expanded to include more populations who believe that it's their birthright to also be able to avail themselves of the subway. Only one of the boroughs of New York City is on the North American continent, right? The other 4 boroughs are on islands. And so we are an island sort of configuration of New York City juxtaposed against rising sea levels and extreme climate events. And we rely on an underground system on a series of islands to move ourselves. And so there are serious climate challenges that I know we're all addressing, and those have an impact on how we deal with sort of the transportation infrastructure. And like I said, this notion of how people are living and working is definitely in flux. The only constant in New York is change, and typically the city has risen to those challenges. And so I look forward to seeing how it evolves in the next 120 years. It'll be interesting, that's for sure.
That was the New York Transit Museum Director, Concetta Ben-Chirvenga. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing, which was produced by Anita Riotta. Our researcher was Sana Jamani, and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Georgina Godwin. Goodbye, and thank you for listening.